Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
Well, we want to welcome you back. We are in Matthew 16 today, and Jesus has just fed a crowd of 4,000. This is his second mass feeding experiences, one of two at my count that shows up in the Gospels. And they've traveled on to another place. They were outside of a city, remember, because they were far away. That's why they needed to provide food. And that's an interesting thing, too. He only provided it in really like desperate times, which is interesting. But now they've gone into a city, and when they get to a city, they interact with the Pharisees and Sadducees. I do want to point out, when I run across those kind of details in the Bible, I'm just owning, by and large, don't care. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, he's talking to Bill or he's talking to a Pharisee, okay, you know. And one of the things that our most recent, this process of going through the Gospels, or more specifically following the life of Christ, is that we've tried to take in all the people in the room and this kind of thing. And so it makes me curious what the implications, like, why would they even tell us? Why not just say some people asked Jesus? And I personally believe every word in the Bible was placed there on purpose, and in particular the Gospels, like there's meaning, deeper meaning to so much of it. And so I don't know if you have anything on that. I didn't ask you beforehand, but I do want to point out it's an interesting contextual dynamic that all of this conversation that we're going to look at today, down through verse 4, is in that context of him answering them. But in general, anything you'd want to point out to us, Connor?
I wonder if you could label the aligning of the Pharisees and Sadducees together as a sign of the times. Like at the very act of the questioning of these two, I don't know if hostile is the right word, but certainly contentious groups coming together to be against Jesus. In a way, and again, there's maybe we'll get into specifically when they're asking for a sign, or when Jesus talks about signs, what he's thinking, what they're thinking. But I do even wonder, just setting this up, if there is a thought towards these people who have contentious religious beliefs against each other are now willing to partner together to go against Jesus, and what that says about the current moment and who Jesus is, and what place they are all at in history. It could be seen as a sign.
Mm-hmm. I wonder about that. I think that is interesting. I was looking up just right now how many times the term Sadducee even shows up, and it's actually more than I anticipated, I think. But not a ton. It's not a ton.
My understanding is they were the minor player to the Pharisees,
right? But just along that mindset, where I really think about them is Luke 20, where they asked Jesus that question about like, who will you be married to in heaven? And so that's where I think of them. But they don't believe in the resurrection, and Paul will manipulate this in the future. So we're talking, I don't know how many years after this. But I do think you're right. This doesn't show up, and it's a rare thing, and I think that's the main point. And it makes me wonder, when I was growing up, my dad was a preacher, and when he would go to things, like he would go to the Better Business Bureau, which in these smaller towns, that was a practice. You know, the ministers were on there. And so as long as it was the Better Business Bureau, he could be there. Mm-hmm. But if he was just getting lunch with the pastor at the Baptist church or the priest at the Catholic church, there were going to be questions, you know? Yeah. And nowadays, there's still that separation in some communities, but more and more people are not asking those questions as much. And I think a big part of it is because churches are closing. You know, I think a big part of it is because of, like, sign of the times. It's one of those things, the pressure. And I think a lot about this dynamic of, do we have a common enemy? Because if we have a common enemy and can identify it, we'll feel more united. But a lot of times, I think in my experience, at least with church culture, and it's an older experience. I know a lot of younger people don't have this experience, and I hope they don't. Let me say that. But there was a lot of like who your enemy was within the church. It happened all the time. You know, well, we don't talk to that family. and usually it had something to do with, the stated reason was, well, doctrinally they believe something wrong. But a lot of times it was really just somebody got their feelings hurt kind of thing. But I think more and more it's the same thing with, churches used to hire and fire preachers it's just a cliche every couple years. And then now they're keeping them a lot more. And I think part of it's a sign of health. And then I think part of it is, man, the times say it's hard to find a preacher. There's not a lot of new preachers relative to how many congregations there are. And so I think there could be some real merit to that.
Yeah, I absolutely think there is. And it's not just I think it's good that you pointed out just the basic reality of being human, that it is much easier to unite two separate groups of people if they have a common enemy than if the two separate groups of people have a common ally. There's just certain ways that our brain is wired for that to be true and for that to be the case. While acknowledging that is important, also remembering that this can so easily infect our mindset when it comes to the church and it comes to being followers of Jesus, that it is so ubiquitous in so many things we do and so appealing because it offers some temporary safety in a lot of circumstances. And yet this is one of those areas just as much as any personal area that we are always called to die towards. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend is not something that's compatible with being a follower of Jesus, because my enemy is my neighbor who's to be loved, and my enemy's enemy is also a neighbor to be loved.
Right.
And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that we have these well-worn ways to view the world that are just everywhere, and they can infect how we view the church and how we view, like, well, this is just common sense, this is just the way these things are. But even the things that we assume are just base realities oftentimes are actually not compatible with the gospel.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I was thinking, how did we get around that? Because that's probably, if you're like, what is the main doctrine of this church? Not main. What are the top 10 doctrines? Enemy of my enemy is my friend was one of them. Mm-hmm. But the reason I think we didn't make corrections is because we refused to acknowledge it. We were like, well, that's not how we function.
Sure.
Even as we function that way.
I think this is really fascinating, where it's like I have doctrinal differences with some Catholics. And the history of like the recent church in my life is like there are times when things are relatively kind of at ease, and it becomes very important to the church at large to differentiate between, well, here's why I'm different than a Catholic, or here's why I'm different than a Baptist or a non-denominational. But when there's high strife, when there's a terrorist attack from a Muslim, or there's a gaining atheistic movement, then it becomes like, well, it ends up looking a lot like an Avengers movie, a team up or whatever, of like, we're gonna have to settle our differences now as we fight. And again, there's a part of it where I think about the beauty of unity and what the church should be, and what I want to be like. Our unity with Catholic brothers and sisters, or Baptist brothers and sisters, non-denominational, Presbyterian, whatever, our unity with brothers and sisters should not come because we found a common enemy, but a common neighbor to be loved.
Mm-hmm. That's good, man. Really well said. So I'm going to jump into verse 1. Now, I don't know how much that has to do with anything in the study, but that was fascinating to me. I enjoyed that. So the Pharisees, Matthew 16, the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, "When evening comes, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red.' And in the morning, 'Today will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast.' You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the sign of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." Jesus then left them and went away. Interesting. Mm-hmm. So this is one of those passages that, so I hadn't read this before just now. I mean, I've read it in my life, but not in the last weeks or months. And now that I read it, I'm like, what will we talk about today? There are a few passages I'm like, well, we'll see where this goes. So I'm glad to be the first one to ask, hey, Connor, what do you find amazing about this interaction?
What amazes me, man, Jesus has so many ways of communicating that if you aren't careful, you'll just skip over what he says. So he ends this kind of mini rant against the Pharisees and Sadducees, but he says, "A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." And that, it's so funny because you just, oh, okay, accept the sign of Jonah. Well, what does he mean by the sign of Jonah? He means that ultimately he will die for 3 days, be buried, and then we'll resurrect. We'll come out of the big fish and have life again. And it's like, the way he phrases that is so funny to me. But none will be given except possibly the biggest sign you could possibly ever have. And again, I don't know, I can't extrapolate all of the intention of what Jesus means by that wordplay there. But I just can't help but laugh at it and appreciate it.
That is fascinating. Yeah, and it doesn't show up much in Jesus' words. It makes me wonder, is the term sign of Jonah common parlance? Like, has it ever been used by...
That's a good question. I don't know. We could find out very quickly. I mean,
I know they knew who Jonah was, but this idea of, are you going to get a sign of Jonah? Because who else is thinking they're going to be dead and thrown into a fish, and this to happen again. And so it is interesting. I wonder with the Pharisees and Sadducees, like the abruptness of the interaction. Then Jesus left them and went away. I'm like, okay, are these the least tenacious Pharisees and Sadducees? They're like, the pacifist Pharisees and Sadducees went. I mean, if they're really looking to test him, this is weak testing in my mind. And maybe it's my ignorance, which I would gladly own, But it is interesting that this just cuts it off for them. So then it makes me wonder, did he give them... I'm assuming Jesus did what was right to love the Pharisees and Sadducees, to give them an invitation to look into things of God, because that's my assumption about every interaction with Jesus. He's inviting, hey, I want you to consider looking into God, and depending on the nature of the conversation, here's the way I want you to think about it. What kind of God would, for example, expect that you can read the signs of the times? We were talking earlier about what this generation needs, and just those general things, like before we started recording. And I'm like, okay, so is this us? And I'll go ahead and put this into I don't know if this is perplexing or not, but it feels that way. It's like, what am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah.
In terms of, and I guess that's it. So this will be my perplexion is are we supposed to be reading the signs of the times? And what does that mean? Does that mean looking into our world today? So did I, when I was talking about churches uniting more, like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we have this movement called Unite My City. And I sat in a room with, 40 lead pastors. I was the only one that probably was like, I'm a minister, but just a week ago, and we're talking about homelessness and what do we do about it. And I think that's really healthy. I always learn something from that. So is that a sign of the times that we're observing, hey, here's what's happened in homelessness? Or is it more predictive? Yeah. Is it like, we need to look around the corner? Okay, so we're embracing AI now. So what's the church going to look like in 10 years? In this particular case, Jesus is asking them, and I guess that's where this takes me, as I'm just literally thinking out loud, is the idea of he's saying this in relationship to them not believing in who he is, because that's this ongoing conversation of it's his identity. And so he's like, you should be paying attention to the things happening around you, and they would lead you to believe that I'm who he says. I think that's a good read. I mean, does that make sense to you?
And adding on top of the maybe what they would consider rumors and what we would know to be the reality of actual miracles, and the signs. Those, I think signs can also be interpreted with those facts also thrown in there.
Right. Yeah. So if he, for example, said, well, find me a blind guy, and then that would, I'm not suggesting it would have satisfied them fully emotional, but it would have satisfied this question.
Yeah.
Like, can you show us a sign from heaven?
Well, and I think, you had kind of wondered, well, why does it stop here? Why is there not more back and forth to this interaction? And it's like, I wonder, like, in their minds, Pharisees and Sadducees, if they're like, oh, we won that. We got that. Because, like, there are many times where it's like, oh, man, I've got to make Jason answer for his belief on a specific issue, or I've got to make Jason, answer for an action his church took or whatever. And if in my mind I can construe it to be like, well, you didn't give a direct answer, or his answer was kind of all over the place, or like it wasn't worded with the exact incantation that I require for my needs, for my society, for my church to feel comfortable. And what I wonder for the Pharisees and Sadducees is like, Jesus says this, and for them, are they like, oh, he's a question dodger? He didn't really, like we asked for concrete signs, and then he's throwing up all these words in their mind. Are they? And again, we can't read intonation, but like, are they thinking, oh, Jesus panicked now, and what do we got him on the back heel here there? So again, we can't say that for sure. That's a possible reading of why it stops here. But I think it's really interesting. I think that gets to the core of kind of what's happening here, where the Pharisees and Sadducees are asking for these signs, and Jesus is telling them like your framework for this, your framework for how you are doing your life and how you're trying to perceive God is so out of whack and off base that like you just can't even begin. Like you are so lost right now that I can't speak to you. Like the way that you're trying to communicate about these things is not the same way that God needs you to communicate about these things, wants to communicate to you about these things. And so I need to speak about these things in a way that like is of me and not of your man-made ideals for what the Messiah should be. And I think all the time I go to Jesus with it. I go to Jesus like the Pharisees and Sadducees in this story all the time, where there are signs and there are wonders that I've seen Jesus perform and experienced. But there are times in my life where those feel distant, they don't feel as real. And I will want to go to Jesus and be like, okay, let's do things like we did before. Let's show me like you did in the past. And I think the thing that I always have to keep putting out in front of me, that the reason that Jesus performed signs and miracles in the past for me in my life, I don't think is because he was trying to pass the test that I wanted to give him. And I think ultimately that's the problem the Pharisees and Sadducees are having here, is they think they are the test graders that they get to give to the Messiah. And in their mind, Jesus failed the test here. And the truth is, I all the time go to God with my test and demand he take it and pass it. And every time I do that, I think Jesus is going to speak to me, or Jesus is going to work with me in a similar way. Because if I think that I get to give the God of the universe tests and I get to grade him, then he's going to have to communicate to me in a very different way than the way I approached him, because we are just not on the same plane at that point.
Yeah. And my head's going in a bunch of directions. One thing that pops into my mind, though, that I think is interesting is, when the devil is tempting Jesus and he says, hey, throw yourself off this high place and the angels will help you. And he quotes a scripture, this kind of thing. It's like, well, what's unreasonable about that? You know what I mean? It's a sign. It would be a miracle if you jumped off a high place. Now it's not needed. It's totally unnecessary in terms of, can't you find some real problem in the world? But you could. And my sense of his rejecting of it is honestly exactly what you're talking about. It's like, that's the do not put the Lord your God to the test feel of things. So then it makes me wonder, when he heals the guy, it's in Mark 2, where he heals the guy lowered down, through the roof. But he says, hey, your sins are forgiven first. And I've often wondered if the Pharisees or the teachers of the law or whoever were there, again, me kind of, those fellas, whoever they are. But if they hadn't been there, if everybody had been like, oh, that's wonderful, he forgave him of sins, would he have healed the guy's paralysis? Or would he have said, you guys should come down, carry this guy back to his street corner or wherever he's at? Because he literally says, so you'll know I have the power to forgive sins, then I'm going to physically heal this guy. But if they had been convinced of it, then, here we are. And so this is the part is if he, and again, when you're doing it in a crowd, that means, so if he's in a crowd and you and I are there, he's thinking about you trusting in him and me trusting in him simultaneously. So that gets more complicated. But if it's just one-on-one, then he may take a really hard stance, like a much more firm way of presenting his love, versus maybe with me, he's like, man, Jason's going to need a lot of soft accommodation here, because he's always going to act out of love. And so it is fascinating what he's trying to communicate, even to the extent of him knowing, hey, we're going to let this run. I know there's going to be a percentage, if not all these fellas are going to walk away and be like, yeah, gotcha. Yeah. And, we don't have an example where he couldn't do it.
My mind jumps to the rich young ruler and a time where Jesus kind of gives, somebody comes to Jesus with like their perfect score that they want to show him that they've aced the test, and they need that last little bit of extra credit, and Jesus kind of approaches on their level, and that person can't possibly in their mind get the extra credit to pass the exam. And I think there are times, I think there's a lot of wisdom to what you're saying here, where somebody came to Jesus with their rubric for how things were being done, and Jesus spoke to them as an individual, and we're more than willing to be like, okay, well, let's go forward. Let's use your headspace. Let's use where you're at, and let's work it out. And then there are other times where he's not willing to do that, and there's a difference between group setting and individual setting. And I think it's very instructive, because like something we talk about all the time, it'd be so easy to be like, oh, okay, perfect. That means that if we do not have our categories straight when we have a conversation with somebody we disagree with, that we can never, like, we just have to, I don't want to say Jesus obscuring here, but we have to speak in riddles and be mystic and not have any, be concrete ever. And that's not what Jesus is getting across here. But I do think there is some general wisdom when we think about, man, how do we love people that are coming to us that we can begin to tell are just there. The way they view God, the way they view reality is so distant from how we view it and what we believe to be the truth of things. And if they think that if they think we're using the same operating system, like I think the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they think that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. We're the leaders, and so whether we think he's true or real or not, he's going to be using the same operating system as us. He's going to be using the same base of reality or the same structure and framework that we are, and it can be really instructive in a moment to be like to reject that notion completely. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I'm kind of startled by that, because I think I struggle with this all the time, where I'll have a conversation with somebody. This happened a lot actually at work recently, where I'll have like really good spiritual conversations, and then something will come up and I realize like, oh, I thought we were kind of coming from like, I thought we were like, as the kids say, vibing. Like I thought, oh man, we're like a lot more connected and unified. And they'll say something that is so like a hard right turn that is so distant from what I would consider something of Jesus, that I'm like, oh, okay, like I can begin to fit in the pieces of things they said before into what they just espoused. And it's really easy for us to assume, whether it's at church, it's our modern day culture, that our operating systems are all the same, and they're just not.
Yeah, and that is, I really appreciate that. My mind went to the centurion, I suppose, where he said, hey, come heal my servant. And he's like, but don't come. So it's like on one hand, you're like, so you're letting and if I'm Jewish, I'm like, so you're letting the Gentile, the unclean guy, dictate your steps, Jesus? And Jesus like, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then here it's like, they just want a sign. I mean, clearly it's effortless for you. It doesn't take anything from you. And why not give it to him? And there's a good reason. And I may or may not know it. I mean, I have my suspicions, but I think the application that is so good is don't assume because you think some way that God thinks like you. And I don't know why that seems like, man, that's a really good point. It does seem like a really good point to me. I just made it, but I know there's a little bit of I don't know, arrogance in there, but it's that idea that I realize, I always think God, well, especially when in my younger years, I thought, well, if I'm praying for this to happen, certainly God wants this to happen. And then when stuff didn't happen, especially serious stuff for me personally, I'm like, okay, what does this mean? Either he's just mean, or maybe I don't always want the same things as God. And when I say it now, it seems so elementary and so silly, but I do think, especially when there's tension, here's how we should do this churchy thing. And somebody's like, no, I think we should do it like this. It's like, well, this is God's way, of course. Why? Well, because either we've always done it this way or it's the way I prefer. And I think there's something so healthy about saying, I have this sense of things, and I'm going to follow that sense because that's what I think God's given me in the past. But I want to be so open to correction, if for no other reason. I don't want to be like the Pharisees and Sadducees who Jesus just told them a message, and there's no evidence that they caught it at all.
That is good, man. I love you wrapping in the faith of centurion, because I think that is it's very, very helpful. I'm going to move on to what perplexes me, and so maybe this was not a bad reading, but just a modern reading for me, that I missed this just until literally like 20 seconds ago. It says the Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. Are they asking for a like a meteorological are they asking for a rainstorm? Are they asking for a tornado? Are they asking from an actual sign from heaven? Because I know for me, it's really easy to because it's in our modern day, we want to get away from like, oh, God is just an old man with a white beard in the sky. But the way that the way my understanding, at least the Pharisees and Sadducees and the Jewish people thought of the heavens was that it was like the heavens were above the vault in the sky. And so I'm wondering, like, are they actually asking for a weather event from Jesus?
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't know. That's certainly a possibility. And I think it perplexes me. Well, it perplexes me because like I missed that, and like I'd have to do some more research if that specifically is what they're asking for. And so it perplexes me that I didn't think about that first, but it also perplexes me and intrigues me in a lot of different ways. Cause like, if that is true, if they're wanting him to calm us, similar to him calming the storm, or him, walking on water, they're wanting some sort of weather related event for him to show his powers. Because that was, so for so many, that was a sign of God moving, was these gargantuan things that they assumed meant that God was listening or angry or happy or active, and they wanted Jesus to do one of these things. Maybe that's a possibility. Maybe it's not. Yeah,
that's interesting too. And in the Old Testament, in the law, there's multiple times. Certainly in the prophets, there's multiple times it pops up where he's like, "Hey, you notice that nothing's growing because you're not pleasing me, like you're not worshiping me." So what does nothing growing come from? Well, bad weather, no weather, and so it is possible. I have read this many times and never even thought about that. Yeah. I always assumed it's just a sign from the power of God, basically.
It is funny because then he immediately goes on and starts talking when evening comes, and then
it actually makes more sense.
It does make more sense. And it's also one of those areas where it's so easy to read the Bible from a modern perspective that we lose sight of what they're trying to communicate here. And it is funny. Maybe it is similar, closer to the devil of like, well, cast yourself off. Like, well, Jesus could cause it to rain. Jesus could cause it to lightning or storm, or for the clouds to make a really cool, animal in the sky. I don't know. Jesus could do any number of those things. But on a similar extent, it's like, man, what would it be like if you had the Messiah in front of you and you could ask him of something like, well, Jesus, you should make the sky out there really cool, or you should throw yourself down and have the angels do a sick paragliding move to catch you or whatever. You're like, or you could ask for like some healing, you could ask for some salvation, from some forgiveness. And so like, if it is for them, they're like, well, show us a cool weather event. It's like, then it becomes even more frivolous of like, what a small, it's a gigantic request, but it shows how, impoverished it would show how impoverished their view of what the Messiah is trying to do is.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. So I'm on the amazed side because I've already shared what perplexed me. I think what's interesting to me is, and this even makes it does make more sense to me, but it's more valuable, is I dramatically underappreciate how rich Jesus's allegories, metaphors, is illustrations, examples are. And a big piece of it's because I've been raised with them. Mm-hmm. And so when something is said, I'm like, well, yeah, of course we think that. And I'm like, oh, it's only of course because I've heard this, hundreds of times. But that idea of him, so they're asking for one thing, and I would be all tied up into, well, should I or shouldn't I? And I don't think he's thinking of that. I think it's immediate. He knows. And then he's using these words, and he's basically saying, look, you know how to tell what's happening. Mm-hmm. You know how to read the world. Like, he's even giving them credit. He's not like, you're ignorant of all things. He's like, you're smart about some stuff. And he goes, you know how to do this, but you can't interpret what's happening in front of you like I am the Son of God. And this is interaction with the Pharisees, or at least with some of their members. We're on a dozen interactions now. And so it's like, this is mind-blowing to me. And I haven't even touched on a wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, because that's ouch. You know what I mean? It's like they really, their identity, even with their differences in doctrinal views, their identity is we are not wicked and we are not adulterous. Like, we're the opposite. Like, we are the faithful, and we judge the people that are wicked and adulterous. So there's no... That's the other thing, too. There's no... And they picked up stones to stone him because he called them wicked and adulterous. There's none of that. But it's just so amazing how succinct, like just 3 verses basically for him, and how cutting it is, but also how brilliant. He's like, things. Why can't you pay attention? And then, I'm just noticing this, even though I just read it a few minutes ago, but it's like he's saying, do you understand? Because this is also part of that sign of the times. The people that ask for a sign. And I'm like, okay, what's this say about all these other people that ask for healing and things like that, are wicked and adulterous, and none's going to be given it except this, And so then that throws my mind into, okay, so then the other signs are for different purposes. They have to be, or he would not participate in something wicked and adulterous, And so, that amazement brings up just about as many questions and answers to me. But I do really appreciate how quick he was, how salient he was, even if the audience at the time couldn't appreciate it.
Yeah, man, I think it's one of those areas where I think this is a muscle that, man, the church is going to have to exercise. And I think just followers, it'd be well suited to exercise, to take on the practice of both analyzing and thinking through the allegories and metaphors and symbolism that Jesus uses, and that the ancient Hebrew writers use, because it's just rife in the Old Testament, and also participating in the creative act of trying to give shape and form in the form of our own metaphor to these grand mysteries of what Jesus is touching on. I'm always going to first and foremost want to center the stories and the metaphors that Jesus uses in terms of defining, truth and reality of who God is. And I also want to be a part of thinking through, not new ways, but expanded ways of giving shape to the mysteries that Jesus is trying to communicate to us. There's a quote that's become famous recently, and it's not that I necessarily agree with it completely, although maybe I do, but it's a quote from Barry Taylor, the AC/DC road manager. It says, "God is the name of the blanket we put over the mystery to give it shape." And one of the things that is so enriching for me is when I hear people, even people who don't necessarily believe in Jesus, but they sense and they know that there is something else out there, and they try to give form and shape and try to put words and metaphor and poetry to the feeling that they are starting to brush up against. And so often for me, when I encounter those people, when I encounter those stories, those metaphors, those poetries, the artwork, even if they're not in my stream, it so often easily connects back to the metaphors and the stories and the allegory that Jesus has already given us. And so this is one of my personal things. I just think the church will just be would be so blessed if we were a people who began to not just assume that when Jesus tells, I think it's so easy. You talked about the story of the prodigal son. That's just so easy and basic for us. And it's something that we've just, it's true. And that's that points to the greater realities and greater facts that Jesus is trying to get across here. But it's like, man, one of the ways that story can become more beautiful for me is if I hear other people approaching the truth that Jesus so well communicates in that, and words it and phrases it in new or different ways that give me a new angle to appreciate what Jesus already done for us. And so it's just, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with this specific passage, but you bringing that up there, it's just got me, it's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, of the richness of how Jesus communicates is so vast and so beautiful. And one of the ways that I have increased my appreciation and my wonder for how he communicates is by both taking in the best that others have to offer in terms of also trying to give metaphor and shape to these grand mysteries, and also some of the people that stumble and fumble and can't necessarily give as great of a metaphor or similes or whatever. And so that's just something that's been a real blessing for me recently.
Yeah, and I think this relates. I think I was hearing all your words. I just want to, you can correct me or modify, edit this a bit, but when Paul says in Philippians 4, whatever is true, whatever's noble, right, if anything is lovely. So that was a really eye-opening scripture when it really landed with me, in that, high school years, early high school years, I listened to a lot of Van Halen, and this was right when Sammy took over. But anyway, now I listened to almost exclusively David Lee Roth, Van Halen, and then just a few of the albums after Sammy took over. But there was a part of listening to one of his solos, not so much like Eruption, but like Cathedral or something, where it felt transcendent and it felt just beautiful. And I remember thinking, oh, this wouldn't be accepted in church, not just because I went to an a cappella church, but it wouldn't be appreciated. It'd be like, well, that's of the world, this is of the world. And there was I grew up in a really defined, this is of the world, and this is not. Now, the irony was the people that were telling me this is of the world went out and lived in the world,
of course,
most of their lives, but they were like, this is bad, this is good. And I'm like, well, if the rain falls on the just and the unjust, if something grows in the unjust person's field, we would call that good, And so if God gives giftedness to all humanity and somebody uses that giftedness to create something beautiful, then it's still beautiful. And this may be so elementary to other people, but for me, it basically what it did, it really raised that sense of, oh, we've separated this all. The church has separated it all.
Yeah.
This is secular. And the secular world is, yes, saying don't bring your God stuff here. But I think it's the church that was like, this is sacred space and this secular space, which translated to a kid's mind of, this is where God works. This isn't where God works. And we got to go break in and take God there.
Yeah.
And then I had actual life experience. I'm like, no, God was already there. I didn't convince this guy by saying, 12 sentences that, oh, there is a God. Yeah. God was already at work there.
Yes. And I want to add on top of that, to try to hone my point even farther. When I was a youth pastor, selecting movies for like a retreat night was incredibly difficult, because
it was easier to choose a wife.
Yes, 100%, 100% easy, 100% easier. I went with the first one that would have me. No, I'm just kidding.
Don't listen, Hannah.
I mean,
he had so many possibilities.
That is partially true, and also just a testament to God's goodness that first try would be so
I
good.
went with the first one that could control me. That is true.
But it was so hard to pick movies, because it's like, okay, do I want to pick a low budget Christian movie that has a message behind it and try to wrap it into something, but the movie sucks because it's a low budget Christian movie? Or do I find a quote unquote secular movie that maybe has a good point in it, and then I just have to edit out a few parts that have bad cuss words or whatever, and try to drive the point across? And I think about like that trying to find the perfect movie to encapsulate a message or a theme or an idea was it was a big headache trying to do that. And yet I think now what I wish I could go back and do is say, like, hey, I'm going to show you the Lord of the Rings, and at the end of the Lord of the Rings, you have I'm pretty sure an atheist director interpreting a Catholic writer who is attempting, well, saying he's not writing any allegory towards Christianity is actually doing it subconsciously. And there's a scene at the end of The Return of the King where the evil's been defeated, and Aragorn has been crowned as king, and he bows along with all of Gondor to the hobbits, to the smallest of these. And it's like every time I see that, I tear up. It's beautiful. It's great. And that why I tear up is because it's pointing to a greater truth and a greater reality, and that message is so good. And it's like, oh man, I want people to see that message. And the message I'm trying to get across now is like, you can also participate in that, right? Like these things have not been frozen and stopped. Like The Return of the King came out in 2003, and that feeling that I have in that was created in 2002 or 2001, whatever. And that ongoing creation, that ongoing ability to give to add form or shape to point people back to the grand truths of God is not just something done by artistic people, or not just done by people in the past, but it's something that he can invite you into now. And so that's the finishing part of not just like be amazed by the way that Jesus uses story and uses allegory and uses metaphor. Yes, be amazed by the grand artists of our day and age, and seek to find those stories, but also participate in them, because hearing stories is transformative. Hearing truly great metaphors is transformative. But if you ever have the time where you stumble upon one yourself that begins to like thrum with your inner being, man, for me that. And not just thrum with my inner being, but thrum with my knowledge of who Jesus is. That for me, that's the good stuff.
Yeah, I think so. And I think to me, you just described walking with the Spirit.
Absolutely.
You know, it's that idea, which often is hard to grasp, but I think that's the way you explained that is really great.
Absolutely. And I think that the helpful part for this is like, we have a tendency as Christian people to be like, if somebody were to describe that to me, I'd be like, oh, it's walking with the Spirit. Oh, I want to help people give shape and form to what they're describing. I think that's really good. The thing that I always want to be careful of is I don't, by my definitions and by my desire to have people recite my incantation correctly, that I cause them to stumble in their pursuit or in their gaining of appreciation of the grander truths. And here's the thing: I myself have this temptation. Like we all have different areas where it's like, oh, this sounds great or grand. But if I see somebody stepping into a particular area that I have a lot of sensitivity towards, I want to fence them in and box them in into what makes me comfortable, into what makes me feel safe, so that I know that they're not questioning my thoughts or my ideas or whatever. And I think one of the things that like I want to be like Jesus, right? And I want to view the world he views the world. And if I'm being truthful about that, and if I'm being honest about that, then there are lots of times where Jesus is telling stories, telling parables, defining a reality that if I can be truthfully honest with myself, is outside of the fences that I have placed up in my mind. And so part of the work that I want to do is I don't want to rob the true richness of the story by pretending it fits neatly into my box. And so that's a lot that has nothing to do with what we talked about this passage.
I think it has everything to do, because I need to fit it to my little, what do you call it? My little fences.
Pin, like playpen, petting zoo, fence. I don't know, when I think about this, I don't know why I always think about the petting zoo at the Tulsa Zoo. Maybe it's because I'm just at the zoo often. Not little known fact, but listener, you might not know about me. I'm a frequenter of the Tulsa Zoo, because when you pay for a pass, it's something you can go do with your child without paying any extra money.
That's right.
And that is the message that Jesus is trying to communicate.
Yeah, exactly. Grace, peace, and love.